this is a little bit of a general question, but almost a bigger picture question that we touched on a little bit, but let's just touch it in a full way, which is what have all the psychedelic studies you've conducted taught you about the human mind, about the human brain and the human mind? Is there something, if you look at the human scientist you were before this work and the scientist you are now, how has your understanding of the human mind changed?
I'm thinking of that in two categories. One kind of more scientific. I mean, they're both scientific, but one more about the brain and behavior and the mind, so to speak. And as a behaviorist, I always see sort of the mind as a metaphor for behavior. So, but anyway, that gets philosophical. But it's really increasing so the one category is increasing the appreciation for the magnitude of depth. I mean, so these are all metaphors of human experience. That might be a good way to, because you use certain words like consciousness and whatnot. It's like we're using constructs that aren't well defined, and unless we kind of dig in. But into human experience, like that, the experiences on these compounds can be so far out there or so deep. And that, like, and they're doing that by tinkering with the same machinery that's going on up there. I mean, my assumption, and I think it's a good assumption, is that all experiences, there's a biological side to all phenomenal experience. So there is not, the divide between biology, and experience or psychology is it's not one or the other. These are just two sides of the same coin.
I mean, you're avoiding the use of the word consciousness, for example, but the experience is referring to the subjective experience. So it's the actual technical use of the word consciousness of subjective experience.
And even that word, there are certain ways that like sort of like if we're talking about access consciousness or narrative self-awareness, which is an aspect of like, you can wrap a definition around that and we can talk meaningfully about it, but so often around psychedelics, it's used in this much more, in terms of ultimately explaining phenomenal consciousness itself, the so-called hard problem, relating to that question, and psychedelics really haven't spoken to that, and that's why it's hard, because like it's hard to imagine anything. But I think what I was getting is like that psychedelics have done this by. The reason I was getting into the biology versus mind psychology divide is that just to kind of set up the fact that I think all of our experience is related to these biological events. Mm-hmm. So whether they be naturally occurring neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine, et cetera, and a whole other sort of biological activity and kind of another layer up that we could talk about is network activity, communication amongst brain areas. Like this is always going on. Even if I just prompt you to think about a loved one, like there's something happening biologically. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's always another side of the coin. So, and another way to put that is all of our subjective experience outside of drugs, it's all a controlled hallucination. In a sense, like this is completely constructed. Our experience of reality is completely a simulation. So I think we're on solid ground to say that that's our best guess, and that's a pretty reasonable thing to say scientifically.
Like all the rich complexity of the world emerges from just some biology and some chemicals.
So in that definition implied a causation. It comes from, and so that's we know at least there's a solid correlation there. And so then we delve deep into the philosophy of like idealism or materialism and things like this, which I'm not an expert in, but I know we're getting into that territory. You don't even necessarily have to go there. Like you at least go to the level of like, okay, we know there seems to be this one-on-one correspondence, and that seems pretty solid. Like you can't prove a negative, and you can't prove, it's like in that category of like, you could come up with an experience that maybe doesn't have a biological correlate, but then you're talking about there's also the limits of the science. So is it a false negative? But I think our best guess and a very decent assumption is that every psychological event has a biological correlate. So with that said, the idea that you can alter that biology in a pretty trivial manner. I mean, you could take like a relatively small number of these molecules, throw them into the nervous system, and then have a 60-year-old person who has, you name it. I mean, that has hiked to the top of Everest and that speaks 5 languages and that has been married and has kids and grandkids and has, you name it, like been at the top, and say, this fundamentally changed who I am as a person and what I think life is about. Like that's the thing about psychedelics that just floors me, and it never fails. I mean, sometimes you get bogged down by the paperwork and running studies and all the, I don't know, all of the BS that can come with being in academia and everything. And then and sometimes you get some dud sessions where it's not the full, all the magic isn't happening. And it's, more or less it's either a dud or somewhere and I don't mean to dismiss them, but it's not like these magnificent sort of reports, but sometimes you get the full Monty report from one of these people and you're like, oh yeah, that's why we're doing this. Whether it's like therapeutically or just to understand the mind. And you're like, you're still floored. Like, how is that possible? How did we slightly alter serotonergic neurotransmission and this person is now saying that they're making fundamental differences in the priorities of their life after 60 years?
It also just fills you with awe of the possibility of experiences we're yet to have uncovered. If just a few chemicals can change so much, it's like, man, what if this could be I mean, like, how? Because we're just like took a little. It's like lighting a match or something in the darkness, and you could see there's a lot more there, but you don't know how much more. And that's